Environmental justice looks like the disproportionate impacts that we see in communities of color, low-income communities, and indigenous populations. Is everything from where coal-fired power plants are being located and the emissions that are impacting those communities. It's also incinerators, it's waste treatment facilities, but it can also be indoor air issues. Everything from the impacts that happen from lead to arsenic, to a number of other types of things like asbestos. But environmental justice is also the lack of access that communities of color, low-income communities, and indigenous populations have to the process, to the creation of policy, how statutes and regulations are being created. And it also deals with resources, which communities are getting the resources and which communities don't. And how that plays out in being able to actually change the dynamics that are happening inside of their communities. I actually started working on social justice issues when I was a teenager, when I was about 16. And I had noticed, a number of different types of impacts, public health impacts, environmental impacts that were happening. I grew up in Appalachia. In my community, we had a coal-fired power plant across the river. Our community was built on top of an old mine. We got our water at one time actually from a spring, and had some heavy metals that were in there. And then we actually had a hog farm that was actually on the other end of our community. And all these different sort of impacts that were happening in the communities, we ended up having a lot of folks who ended up having cancer. So we had a cancer cluster. So there were different things that was driving me and pulling me actually to this work. And then as a student, I had a chance to do an internship at the Environmental Protection Agency, and they began to talk to me about this thing called environmental equity, environmental justice, environmental racism, and I had the opportunity to actually go out to communities across the country and see some of the things that folks in different parts of the country, but were dealing with that were very, very similar, and I was hooked because I was like, this is something I could dedicate my life to because I had a chance to actually be able to give back and help make change happen. So the Environmental Protection Agency has one mission. The administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency, and their job title, has one thing that they're supposed to be focused on, and that is public health and the environment, and protecting that. So the agency does that in a number of different ways, primarily through the various laws that have been passed by Congress, those statutes, those regulations that are put in place to actually protect our air and to make sure that it is moving toward being as clean as possible, to make sure that the water that comes out of our taps is something that is positive for your body and not harmful or impactful, and then also making sure that the land that we utilize, whether it's to grow our crops or for our children that play on, to make sure that it's cleaned. And when any of those things aren't in place, then those regulations kick in to make sure that we're moving in that direction. So I was blessed to be one of the founding members of the Office of Environmental Equity, which became the Office of Environmental Justice. And it actually came out of a set of recommendations from stakeholders. There was something called the Michigan Working Group in the late 80s, early 90s. And they began to engage with Administrator William Riley at that time about some of the impacts that they were seeing around the country. And they wanted there to be a central place in the federal government where communities could come, where they could begin to have conversations and begin to get some resolution on the impacts that were happening inside their communities. And in November of 1992, the Office of Environmental Equity was actually formed. One was able to do a number of incredible things. Created the Environmental Justice Small Grants Program, which actually came out of those recommendations and has provided about $25 million in resources to communities, I believe about 1,600 communities across the country, both in the urban and rural context. Also, the office played a role in the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council and the creation of that. And the beauty of that FACA, a Federal Advisory Committee, is that it began to bring together a number of different types of people and organizations that needed to be a part of helping to make change happen. So you have business and industry, you have grassroots organizations, you had tribal representation, you had state and local governments, and a number of other folks coming together to provide advice and recommendations to the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency on all kinds of different types of issues in the air, and water, and land context. And then you also had the office playing a role in the creation of Executive Order 12898 that President Clinton signed in 1994, which really began to pull all of the federal government together to work in a holistic fashion to address the issues that are happening inside of communities and help them to be able to transform, addressing those impacts, but then helping them to revitalize. And there have been a number of incredible things that have come out of the Office of Environmental Justice. It's actually helped the rest of the federal government to begin to integrate environmental justice, but it also helped to create an intersection point for folks to work more effectively with communities and understand the value that communities bring to both the policy process and also making sure that when we're thinking about the creation of grant programs, that communities have an opportunity to help frame that out as well. The Office of Environmental Equity, which became now the Office of Environmental Justice, is changed in the sense that when it first started, it was a little small office of about 7 folks who were out in communities all across the country, meeting with folks and bringing them to Washington, D.C., hearing the various issues that were going on, helping agency to be able to think more critically about where the gaps were in the work that they were doing and the policies that they were developing. And now the office, has probably about 24, 25 folks who are there, has begun to make sure that the integration of environmental justice and the training that's been necessary has, come full circle. And there's been an ebb and flow over the years under different administrations, because there were different sort of policy focuses, if you will. Both Democrats and Republicans have played a significant role in some of the work that's happened up until our current administration, which has been focused on sort of eliminating environmental justice, weakening its footprint and weakening its ability to help to make change. But the beauty of our country is that we have a democratic process, and that when we see something not moving in the right direction, our vote can actually change that. So I'm very hopeful that we will get back on track. We'll make sure that not only the Office of Environmental Justice, but the Environmental Protection Agency gets back to what it's supposed to do, which is actually protecting the lives of communities. Yeah, so Executive Order 12898 is a critical executive order because it actually begins to help all of these federal agencies to understand that by working together, by leveraging resources, real change can actually happen. Also, the executive order said that each of these federal agencies, and there are 17 of those, have to create annual environmental justice reports that sort of spell out what they've been able to do from a year-to-year basis, how they're helping to make change, who are those communities that they've been able to serve. And that is really important because we need to have those benchmarks, if you will, to know if what we've been doing is actually helping, has it been successful, what is it that we need to do differently, and who are those other partners that we need to be in to pull into the process and to help them to find an intersection point. So the executive order plays a strong role in that. But of course, whichever White House is happened to be in power at that time needs to honor that and needs to make sure that they are pushing that forward and prioritizing what's happening inside of these communities. And Executive Order 12898 gives them that opportunity. It also gives them the opportunity to make sure that the secretaries of those various agencies are meeting on a periodic basis and hopefully also meeting with communities to make sure that they are framing out a set of work that folks are actually asking for. Well, I think that young leaders, and there's just an incredible amount of positive work that's happening by young leaders all across this country and actually outside of the country as well, is that environmental justice, if we don't address the issues that are happening in that space, then we can never actually win on climate change. Because the fossil fuel facilities that are inside of the communities that have been having to deal with environmental injustices are those same fossil fuel facilities that have been warming up the planet now. Those pipelines are the same ones that run through those communities, and we need to be able to address that. So I would hope that young leaders understand sort of these root causes of what we are now dealing with in relationship to climate change have started in many instances in these communities, and that we can actually win by making sure that we are rectifying these impacts that have happened in those communities, and that young voices, the innovation, the intelligence, the action is what is going to be a driver in actually helping to make real change happen. We have to be extremely focused on moving our most vulnerable communities from surviving to thriving. We can no longer allow sacrifice zones, the areas where people place everything that they don't want, having transportation routes that separate communities and pull wealth out of communities and impact people's health. We can no longer have housing developments that have impacts on people's health, that have lead and other types of toxins that are inside of them. We also have to make sure that the jobs that are going to be created in a new green economy, these renewable energy jobs, we have to make sure that communities of color actually own some of those businesses, that the workers are being trained and playing a critical role in the cleanups, but also in this new direction around wind and solar and hydro and so many of the other opportunities in thermal, that we're making sure that those communities are not forgotten or that they're not an afterthought as we begin to move forward and make real change happen.